By the way, the plant we're monitoring is Nitrophila mojavensis, and it occurs both in Nevada and in California. So we're monitoring the California populations right outside of Death Valley Junction. And so because I've been getting up at 3:30 in the morning, I have some notes. So please forgive me if I do a little bit of reading to remind my tired brain. But without further ado, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining me on this lovely summer evening to learn a little bit more about the flora of the Southern Inyo Mountains. It's a place I've been conducting my master's research since fall of 2018. And I'll tell you a little bit of what I've learned in the process. All right. So tonight, I'll just introduce you to the place by talking about the location, a bit about the current vegetation, past vegetation history, geology, a bit about human history, and some of the current uses. I'll go into my objectives, how I carried out my study, touch on results and discussion, and then I'll close with a note on threats and some of my advocacy work. So I read in the chat that some folks have been to the Eastern Sierra, and most people usually look to the west and they look to the Sierra, but the Inyo Mountains are to the east. They're several hundred miles to the north of Los Angeles, and they're in this really topographically interesting location between the highest and lowest points of the lower 48. So that's the place commonly called Badwater Basin in Death Valley National Park at below sea level, and then to the west to Mount Whitney at 14,500 feet. And the place I chose to study is at the very southern portion of the range. So that's zoomed in here. My study area is outlined in red. This area is part of the traditional homelands of the Timbisha Shoshone and Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone tribal nations who still live near the area today. Currently, though, these lands are owned by the federal government and they're administered by the Bureau of Land Management. And there's a few private in-holdings, about 800 acres, mostly left over from the historic mining era. So the entire study area is about 167 square miles. And so I'm half Chamorro. My dad grew up on the island of Guam, a very tiny island in the Pacific. And I like to joke that my study area is about 2/3 the size of Guam. I like to give that context to my dad, who didn't travel very much in the island. And there's a lot of terrain to cover here because it's nearly roadless. So this road here, this is the Cerro Gordo Road. It's the only road that transects the entire study area, but it's pretty much, this eastern half is can be difficult to pass given, if there's a big flash flood or it gets washed out. It'll take a year or two before you can pass it in a regular four-wheel drive vehicle. Similarly, this route here is known as the Swansea grade. This is a kind of a famous Jeep route, and so it's not really suitable for my regular old Toyota pickup. So most of my field work was done on foot or mountain bike on some occasions. But because of the lack of roads and lack of modern development, this area is very ecologically intact. There's just a little bit of evidence of that historic mining activity. And other than that, there's been very little grazing, no recent wildfire. It's in very good shape. So I'm just going to introduce you to a few of the place names I'll be discussing in my talk, starting at the south. So this area in green is the Malpai Mesa Wilderness, with the summit of Malpai Mesa at about 7,800 feet. Above here is the Conglomerate Mesa area with the summit at a similar height. And then you can kind of make out the shadow here. This is the portion of the Inyo Crest that hovers between 8,000 and about 9,500 feet. And so the lowest point is just at the mouth of Daisy Canyon, right at the edge of Death Valley National Park. That's all the way down at 1,800 feet. And in only 6 miles, as the crow flies, you get to the highest point in the study area at 9,694 feet. And I'll give you a sense of what that looks like on the ground. So this is a small canyon right next to Daisy Canyon. It's mainly creosote here as far as perennial vegetation goes. There's no weather stations nearby, but PRISM models suggest that estimate that this area gets about 4 inches of precipitation a year, so not much. But on a really good rain year and unusually high rain year, a place like this will be carpeted in annuals. Going to the other extreme at the highest end of the study area is Pleasant Point. This area tends to have lingering snowpack. Models predict that this area, or estimate that this area gets about 14 inches of precipitation a year. So there's pockets of bristlecone and limber pine up here, and Cercocarpus ledifolius in the background. So I didn't just choose this area because I really wanted to hike in steep terrain. Part of the reason I selected the southern part of the range is because it's at the intersection of the two main provinces that are outside the California floristic province, that being the Great Basin and the desert, in my case, just the Mojave Desert. Additionally, you'll see here in this dark color, this is the White and Inyo Mountains subregion, and in the darker orange is the Desert Mountain subregion. So these areas have been noted for their relatively high levels of endemism, given the desert environment. And the thing that distinguishes, in case you aren't familiar with the White and Inyo Mountains, the thing that distinguishes them from the other desert mountains is the presence of subalpine and alpine habitat, particularly further north. So next I'll show you just a few of the vegetation types so you can get a feel of what the landscape is like. So just below Pleasant Point, below that subalpine habitat, are pretty extensive pinyon woodlands, sometimes co-dominating with juniper, Utah juniper. And then starting at about 7,000 feet, we get these awesome Joshua Tree woodlands. So this is a picture of a Joshua Tree woodland at Conglomerate Mesa at about 7,000 feet. And they have various understories ranging from black sagebrush to Atroplex convertifolia to, in some cases, Guyetta grass. And then pictured here is a black sagebrush scrub, Artemisia nova. This is its more typical form. It's below 1/2 meter. It's classified as a dwarf shrubland. In a lot of cases, there's actually plants that seem intermediate between black sagebrush and Artemisia tridentata. And I've spoken with other botanists who work in the Whites and Inyos, Jim Moorfield, and then Michelle Slayton, who's with the Forest Service, and they've seen similar patterns and have consulted Layla Schultz and a few others. But it's one thing to identify the plants. Sometimes the plants get identified as nova for one character or another, and sometimes they're lumped in with tridentata. But if anyone in the audience works on vegetation, from a vegetation perspective, this would be an interesting thing to look at, because a lot of the shrublands aren't dwarf shrublands. They get up to about 1/2 meter tall. So in another area where we get these really fuzzy vegetation patterns are in the Bajadas. There's a few cases where there are pretty dense stands of creosote, particularly near Saline Valley in Death Valley National Park. But in most cases, it's much more of a mosaic. There's usually a creosote component, but then you also get Ambrosia dumosa or Atroplex hymenelytra or Atroplex convertifolia. Even though there's been some vegetation mapping done, it's quite coarse. And so more work is needed, which was beyond the scope of my study. But again, if there's veg folks in the audience, you should check this place out. So these modern vegetation types are pretty recent. Scientists think that they probably approximated their current composition about 10,000 years ago, given the young age of these desert environments. So we know from widespread fossil evidence in areas we now call the Great Basin and Mojave that for up until the Pleistocene and for part of the Pleistocene, these areas were much wetter and cooler and supported forest ecosystems and at times oak woodlands, especially further south. You know, I'm really fortunate in my study area because there's been these amazing and really detailed studies done both of pollen cores and also pack rat middens that provide really fine scale information about vegetation patterns and vegetation change, especially during the Pleistocene. There's this 800,000 year pollen core taken from Owens Lake, and then the pack rat middens are from Haystack Mountain in the Inyos, and then another one in the Alabama Hills just across the Owens Valley, not too far away from the site. And I had a lot of fun reading about these. It was fascinating to me to see just how I mean, we know this has happened all over in California, but just to see it, just to read the accounts of these different pulses of vegetation change that corresponded with the glacial patterns of the Pleistocene, I found fascinating. So the Inyo Mountains, especially in my study area, weren't glaciated. And so when during these glacial cycles, when conditions were cooler and wetter, the bristlecone and limber pine would come down slope. But these pulses were never quite the same every time. And there was one case where Juniper scapulorum, Rocky Mountain juniper, which is no longer extant in California, actually was present near the study area and perhaps even existed in the study area. So that's just an example of how these different pulses were different every time. And so what we're left with are these remnants of these past times. The most famous probably being the bristlecone pine, which, as I mentioned, occupies these higher elevation locations in the study area. There's also taxa of recent origin. We don't have dates on this specifically, but it's thought that Prudelia is likely of recent origin. These young taxa are likely owing to the recent age of the desert environments and the sky island effect of being isolated by the hotter deserts below. So adding to this rich vegetation history, there's also some amazing geology in this area. There's an abundance of rock types. At the very southern end of the study area at Malpine Mesa, it's mainly volcanic rock, basalt and rhyolite. There's a few little places where there's exposed limestone, but by and large, it's that volcanic rock. And then as you get further north, you get carbonates, which the rare plants tend to occur in. So limestone, dolomite, other sedimentary rock like shale and conglomerate. There's also lots of granitic intrusions associated with the Sierra Nevada geologic activity. And then also in the alluvial areas, we have a small sand dune system, lots of desert pavement, fanglomerate. And so I wish I had drone footage, but I don't. I actually had free access to one, but I couldn't use it because of the pandemic. So you'll have to do with this Google 3D view. And just to orient you, we're actually north of Conglomerate Mesa looking to the southwest. And so this is what that sedimentary rock looks like. It's really apparent on the ground as well. It's light colored. And then to the south at Malpine Mesa, it's much darker, nearly all volcanic. So I'll go just a little bit deeper into the geology to give you a sense of how these rock types were formed. So for most of geologic time, the Inyos weren't mountains at all. In fact, some of you probably know this area was underwater for most of geologic time. But remarkably, Conglomerate Mesa right here, towards the end of the Permian and the beginning of the Triassic, so about 250 million years ago, this was actually inferred to be a tropical island. And they know that or infer that because of the different deposits on either side of this uplift and what looks like to be deposits that were non-marine in origin. So geologists have identified 12 endemic fusulinid fossils from this area. And also there's a really unique layer of intact stratigraphy from this time. So because of all the endemic plants in this area, I just like thinking about how there used to be endemic fauna as well. So by and large, most of the rocks that were deposited are marine in origin, both deep water, shallow water, and then also as the marine waters retreated. There's volcanic activity here from the Jurassic, here from about within the last 7 million years. And then of course, all those more recent alluvial deposits on the periphery of the study site. So the Inyo Mountains have it all, right? They have cool rocks, they have cool vegetation history, but surprisingly, there haven't been many botanical collections here, even though this area was visited all the way back in the 1800s, starting with Colville's Death Valley expedition. So Colville for a bit was camped out here in Keeler and traveled the Death Valley or the Keeler Death Valley route across here into Death Valley National Park. But it appears that they did not make any collections in the study area during that time. So it's not until 1935 when Mark Kerr came onto the scene. Now, Mark Kerr As an interesting fellow, he was an early curator of the Eastern California Museum and made some collections for several California institutions. And he mainly collected along Cerro Gordo Road and a little bit along the route to San Lucas Canyon. And then a few years later, Annie Alexander and her partner Louise Kellogg came along and collected many of the same taxa in the same location, one of them being what later became the type for Peridoli inyoensis. Very few people collected south of Cerro Gordo Road. It was only Philip Munns. On about a day and a half in 1947, he did a little bit of collecting on this route to the Santa Rosa mine and made fewer than 30 collections. So a lot of times people just visited the Inyos en route somewhere else. So they didn't spend much time here. It was only Mary DeDecker, who first came here in 1954, that made repeated visits to the area, and she deserves special mention. So she visited the area 12 times and made some beautiful collections. This is one of my favorites, Penstemon floridus var. Austini. And she actually lived at the base of the Inyo Mountains in a small town called Independence. And so she visited the Inyos extensively and compiled a checklist. However, I found that there weren't actually any boundaries for the checklist, and some of the checklist entries aren't substantiated with vouchers. Additionally, she mainly stuck to roads, and there's very few roads in the Inyos, and so there's a lot of the mountain range that isn't represented. But I'm very grateful for her work because, you know, as some of you know, she's responsible for a lot of conservation in the area and the description of new genera and species. So while we're on the topic of human history, I'm just going to share this one little thing. So you'll notice here in this photo, these are stumps, and these are left over from the historic mining era. So in 1863, silver was found at Cerro Gordo, and it ended up being developed into one of the most profitable mines in California's history. Some people say that it's even responsible for the growth of Los Angeles, and Los Angeles might not be what it is today if it weren't for the wealth that came from these mountains. And so in order to process the silver, these people needed fuel to fire the smelters. So for miles and miles across the Inyos, especially the southern Inyos, mainly the pinyon and the mountain mahogany were cut down, and they were burnt into charcoal in these ovens, which still stand in the study area today. I was out in the Inyos in July. I guess I like doing field work at the hottest time of the year, but my brain was starting to melt, and it was pretty cool to actually find this. It was refreshing to see this artifact. I believe this is a stone that was used to sharpen the tools that these people used to cut down the trees. But today, the type of mining that's being carried out in these areas is quite a lot different, and the scar that modern mining leaves is much more impactful. So the conglomerate Mesa area specifically, which is just south of Cerro Gordo, has had a long history of mining exploration, dating back to the, as far as gold goes, the 1980s. So there's been 12 companies that have looked for gold in the hills here, and some have found evidence of submicroscopic gold deposits. These are also known as a Carlin type gold. And what's interesting about this type of gold is it requires extensive processing in order to be profitable. That typically takes the form of a cyanide heap leach mine. They're quite big and difficult to mitigate any impact. So the company that's interested in this area now, they're called K2 Gold, and this area circled in blue is where they have identified various mining targets. And you'll notice that their targets overlap with several Bureau of Land Management conservation areas. So these hash marks are national conservation lands of the California desert. And in this black outlined area, these are areas of critical environmental concern, which in part were designated because of the rare plants here. The Peridoli inyoensis is one of the big ones. It's endemic to the Inyo range, specifically the southern Inyos. And the person who designated or wrote the report to designate this area wrote that while there haven't been extensive botanical surveys, they suspected that there were many other rare plants. So there's this urgent need when I started my study to establish baseline data because of these mining interests. And as some of you know, it's great that we have these guidelines that require mining companies and et cetera to complete surveys and to analyze what plants might be harmed. But not all years are good rain years, and some plants can be missed. And so this floristic work I did offered the opportunity to do a multi-year study in this area. So my objectives for my work were to complete a specimen-based vascular plant inventory of this area in the southern Inyo Mountains, and also to assess the status of rare plant taxa and assess the status of possible edaphic endemics. If you haven't gathered from my introduction, I'm interested in geology and these plant geology relationships. So I first obtained a permit, which was very important. I got my permit from the Bureau of Land Management, and my goal is to sample from all habitat types, so all different plant communities, geomorphic features, edaphic substrates. And to do this, I used various spatial layers and then also just on the ground field work. A lot of times I would identify new habitat types that weren't mapped. And I played around a lot with different methods, basically creating models to identify interesting areas to survey. But at the scale that interesting plants grow, I found that those data don't exist at the right scale, at least as far as I could find. So I completed these targeted surveys. I would identify potential locations based on what spatial data I did have. And then I also looked for known rare plant occurrences, both inside my study area and just outside, and noted what those habitat types, habitat qualities were, and tried to find similar locations in the study area. And so oftentimes it took backpacking trips. It took many miles of walking to get to those places. And so en route, anytime I encountered something new or a plant in a new habitat type, I would collect it and make a specimen. I also wanted to include as complete a record of the historical collections that I could. So I searched various herbaria databases, CCH1, 2, SignNet, et cetera, and made a list of those. And I used the Jepson Flora project and updated taxonomic treatments to make my identifications compared with the reference collection at Rancho. And then for I followed APG4 for families, with the exception of Borraginales, and then everything below family, I followed Jepson and these updated taxonomic treatments. And sorry if I went into too much detail on the methods. I've been puzzled by reading various floras that don't talk about their methods. And as someone who thought about doing a flora without going to grad school, I was stumped as to how you actually did it. And then as far as my interest in these potential edaphic affinities, I basically compiled a list of plants I observed to have some sort of affinity. And then I cross-referenced that with Mary DeDecker's descriptions, because she noted the same thing, and also descriptions in the Jepson Flora project. Because of some of the management questions at Conglomerate Mesa and Malpai Mesa, and the differences in geology, I also collected as near complete florulas as I could for each location, and then compared the species richness with Chicard Similarity Index. And on to my results. So as far as historical collections go, I located 276. And as part of my research, I spent 97 days in the field and made 915 collections. So my collections are here in the green. I really wanted green dots everywhere, but unfortunately it just wasn't possible. So with the pandemic in the spring, I wasn't able to do field work. And as you know, this year, we're in exceptional drought. And so this is what it looks like out there in those bajadas. Everything's pretty crispy, and I think would make a pretty poor herbarium collection. I wouldn't want to upset Jerry at Reno or Mir at RSA with something like that on a sheet. So I do plan to go back to some of these locations in the future to see what's there. But from what I saw on the ground in 2019, the bajadas do tend to be quite homogeneous. Additionally, there are some locations that were just not safe to sample. Out of all the unsafe places, this is one that I thought maybe I could access because at some point it used to actually be the old road to Saline Valley. You can see the road was blasted out here, but we went up to about there and checked it out and it just didn't seem safe. So there's a lot of canyons with sheer waterfalls on the northeast side of the study area. And I'll need to enlist the help of my canyoneering friends to sample those. But with all that said, I did, I think, collect a reasonable representation of what's on the ground. So, so far I've documented 360 minimum ranked taxa, that's species, subspecies, varieties. These are circumscribed into 54 families and 184 genera. And there really aren't that many non-native species there, only 8. And then by and large, the life forms tend to be herbaceous, so 38% annual and about 33% perennial. So the largest families and largest genera probably come as no surprise, especially to those of you who've done work in the deserts. Asteraceae is the largest family at 72, and then the rest that follow are fairly close to each other. The largest genus is Eriogonum at 23, and the rest follow far behind at 9, 8, and then some of the other genera are maybe 7 or 6. So one thing that was surprising was the high number of rare taxa here. About 8% of the flora are rare and ranked by CNPS. And I found this surprising, and this kind of speaks to, I guess, what my experience was like on the ground. A lot of seeing some of the same things over and over again, punctuated by seeing, well, what is this rare plant doing here? And so to break down these rankings a little bit, for those of you that are interested, 8 of the taxa are ranked by CNPS as 1B, meaning they're rare throughout their range. Most of them just occur in California. 8 are 2Bs, meaning they're rare in California, but more common elsewhere, mainly in Nevada. There's one where more information is needed, so it gets a 3 ranking. That one is Hecastocleus shocklei, an Asteraceae, a very cool plant. And then 13 are on the watch list. So there are ones that CNPS and others are keeping an eye on. And then of these, 17 had never been documented before in the study area. And in addition to that, there were 50 to 60 new occurrences of rare taxa. And there was another 12 that I think could exist inside the study area. They've been documented just outside, and similar habitat does exist inside the area. And then there's another 3 that warrant a little more discussion because of some uncertainty around their conservation status. One being Malacothrix torii and Asteraceae. If you look at the georeferenced records and even dig around within some of the localities, there's 8, maybe 9 occurrences in California, but it hasn't been ranked yet. And part of the reason is because this was once treated by Munns as part of Malacothrix sonchoides. And so it's, I think it was as a variety, but people seem to think this botanist just lumped this. So if you're at an herbarium and can check out that folder, have someone check it out, that would be great to tease out some of those Malacothrix torii. So CNPS can potentially update the status at some point. One of my very favorite plants, I wonder if some of you know this one, Cycladenia humilis varjonesii and Apocynaceae. There's actually a subset, it's been circumscribed as variety venusta before, but the ones that grow in my study area and elsewhere in the Inyos and whites only occur on shale slides. And a student in Lee Johnson's lab at Brigham Young University did some genetic work and found that these really are their own variety, and they warrant recognition. And there should be a paper coming out very soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And finally is Joshua tree, Yucca brevifolia. While not rare, it definitely is threatened throughout its range. And so this is a candidate in California under the California Endangered Species Act. And so a lot of you probably know it's threatened by both climate change and development, and is expected to be extirpated for the most part from California by the end of the century. There's a few places where it's expected to persist, and one of them is actually in my study area in the southern Inyo Mountains. And believe it or not, it bloomed this year in an exceptional drought year. There are a few locations where they put out flowers. So the populations here are doing really well. There's a lot of regenerating plants, and they're doing all right. Okay, one other plant that warrants some discussion is another one of my favorites. They're all my favorites, but Nemacletus inyoensis and Campanulaceae. This was a special plant. It was described by Nancy Morin and Tina Ayers in 2020 while I was doing my study, and it had previously only been documented from the southern whites and the northern Inyos, and no one really knew that it occurred all the way down by Conglomerate Mesa. And yeah, it's a funny thing to be trying to key something that has a very distinct flower. It has these 3 maroon nectar guides or stripes at the base of the lobes. And it clearly didn't match anything in the key. And so I was like, well, this is weird. And then lo and behold, I heard that they were in the process of describing this. So it's a very cool plant. The flowers are only about 2 millimeters wide. They're very small. But it still, to me, is interesting that no one had noticed this prior to I believe it was, oh, my brain is blanking, Steve Matson, who works out in the Eastern Sierra, and you probably know his photography. He spotted it first about 10 years before they described it, but still, no one had noticed it prior to that, including all the botanists who did surveys for mining at Conglomerate Mesa where this occurs. And so it makes me wonder if there are more undescribed plants out there, particularly in these under-collected parts of the desert. So a few other summary notes. 15 of the taxa on my checklist are endemic to California. That might be surprising or not surprising, considering that the boundaries of the Mojave and Great Basin extend well beyond the state boundary of California. There are 4 that are endemic to the White Inyo subregion, one being Perdalea inyoensis, and the other being a very cool astragalus semivarsiflatus. And then just based on my review of descriptions in the Jepson Flora project and Mary DeDecker's checklist, it appears that there's 26 taxa that have strong edaphic affinity, mainly to calcareous substrates. I think 24 out of the 26. All right, and my little Mesa comparison. You know, there's only so much you can do with a sample size of 2, but I still found it personally gratifying to compare these two. They had 87 taxa in common. I think the Jacquard similarity index was something like 4.45, but what can you do with a relative comparison of 2? But I did find it very interesting that, so the blue are the taxa that are unique to conglomerate. There are 11 rare, so many more taxa that are rare here that aren't found on Malpai. And additionally, many more of the ones found on conglomerate are perennial and woody, which are more indicative of a montane type environment, you know, something you might expect. Whereas on Malpai, you don't get, there's no pinyon, juniper, not a lot of the shrub diversity that you get at conglomerate. And just based on my observations, the vegetation patterns were really similar to what you would see in the more in the Bajada landscape. And that could be in part just because of the dark color of the volcanic rock. You know, it's absorbing more solar radiation, the soil temperature is hotter, but of course, a lot more work would be needed to really tease apart those differences. So overall, just based on that preliminary checklist of Mary DeDecker's, clearly more work is needed to nail this number down, but it looks like roughly there's 58 new taxa that are added to the Inyo Mountains. I know for sure 196 new taxa added to the study area. And then this area is in the, by the way, this is Nico Medina. He was a former student at California Botanic Garden, and he helped me locate many taxa in this really cool area with the sand dune system at just west of Malpai Mesa at the southwestern edge of my study area that filled in the range edge for at least 20 taxa. In most cases, anywhere between 5 and 10 miles, not that much, but for Palafoxia arida arida in Asteraceae, it was a range extension of about 60 miles. All right, and so that was what I did for my thesis, but as they say, a flora is never complete, and I can't stop going back to the Inyos, so I wanted to show you a few of the more things that I've found since I finished my thesis work. Just in 2 field trips, I found 4 more rare plants that had not been documented before, and let's see, only 2 of these were on the excluded list and 2 weren't located anywhere near the study area prior. So those would have been Frazera albomarginata, pictured here, which in Inyo County has only been documented in the Last Chance mountain range. And then this penstemon, which is on the watch list, which has been documented further north in the Inyos. And keep in mind that I'm finding these during an exceptional drought year when pretty much everything else was crispy. So this was a very, very special location. Oh, it also helped when I found the Erythranthe calcicola that I had my advisor, Naomi Fraga, with me, who's the monkey flower pro. I don't think I would have found that one on my own. So this is a picture of what it looks like. It was pretty steep out there. You can't quite see it, but it was a sheer drop off. That was the only plant I could collect. But it's really cool habitat in this place, and I'm excited to go back in a month or so to do some more collecting. Now, I also took a photo of this. I believe this is Gallium munsii. That's how it keys out in Jepson. However, Dempster, in her paper on Gallium multiflorum, there's a collection made here by Annie Alexander and Louise Kellogg, and Dempster first called it munsii and then she called it multiflorum. And she mentions in her publication that these plants are actually really strange and they don't fit either circumscription. However, I know Gallium multiflorum is just a mess. So if anyone out here is thinking about working on that, please do, and come look at these plants. There's another photo of it. And it was also cool just to see some old friends, some plant friends that I hadn't seen elsewhere in the Inyos, but I know from other places. So Erysimum capitatum, it was nice to see that flash of yellow in this dry year, as well as Salvia dorii, one that I thought would be more widespread in the study area, but really wasn't. It was isolated to this one particular canyon. So there's some amazing plants that live here, and they've lived here for a very long time, and they're threatened. There's many threats that face them. One of the one that's most pertinent on my mind, and probably a lot of people's minds, is climate change. You know, temperatures are warming, precipitation regimes are changing, and you know, it's unclear how it will impact the flora. We can make guesses. Maybe the seed bank, likely the seed bank will shift. In particular, one plant I worry about is this one, Hesperidanthes jaegeri and Brassicacea. I mean, look at those leaves. They're green, they're succulent, they're glabrous. It doesn't seem like it belongs in the desert. And indeed, these already occupy the most protected microsites in the study area. And I tend to only see maybe 10 plants at a time, not very many. And so this is one I worry about as temperatures warm, if it will be okay. On the other hand, like I mentioned with the Joshua trees, this could end up being a potential refugia for many Mojave type species. However, it won't be a refugia if there's a giant open pit mine here. So one of the other big threats is mining. You know, I've seen from past exploration projects that even exploration leads to soil compaction, introduction of non-native species, destruction of individual plants, and then also, because they're running their equipment 24/7, especially in a dry year like this one, there's an increased risk of fire, especially for an area that's not fire adapted. That could be pretty catastrophic. And then, of course, if this company that's out there now, K2 Gold, if they find what they're looking for, that would basically pave the way for an industrial scale open pit gold mine. And that's because the mining law in the United States all the way back from 1872. It's called the 1872 mining law. It guarantees the right to mine certain minerals, and gold is one of them. And that trumps all other uses, including conservation. So because of that, I have been put in this position where I have the opportunity to advocate for the protection of this place and the plants that grow here. And so I've done this through building relationships with stakeholders who are interested in the fate of this landscape and learning about the conservation needs. And lo and behold, it turns out that, well, what was needed was to tell people what it's like there. And for someone like me, who's an introvert and shy, when people are telling me like, oh, you should do more presentations or write articles, I was like, oh, really? Can't I just give you my checklist? But no. So I think I've given 17 presentations in the last few years, and I've written articles, I've been in videos, and you know, it's because I really believe that this place should be protected. It's very unique. I've never seen any place like it. And so I've done some extra work to help with this. You know, the other thing is not everyone can make it out to this place. It's very difficult to access. And so I guess I think of myself as an ambassador because I've spent about 100 days on the ground. I think I have a really unique perspective about what's going on the landscape. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out our coalition's website, protectconglomeratemesa.com. Public comments will be needed very shortly, sometime this summer. So keep your eyes on their mailing list if you choose to sign up. All right, so with that, I would like to thank all the organizations and individuals who helped me complete this work, particularly you, the California Botanical Society, for funding my work. All the people who came out in the field with me. My field vehicle died in the middle of field season, so some friends lent me their field truck. I didn't have a place to live at one point, so people let me stay at their place. And also all the herbaria that made loans available during the pandemic. I know that was a really difficult time to be loaning out specimens, so I greatly appreciate that. So that's it. Thanks all for your attention. And I guess if we have time, I'll take any questions.